RCIA has participated during the season of Lent by providing a meal for our guests that visit with us on Sunday evenings from Room in the Inn. This has been going on for a very long time. We are one of the very first parishes or churches that participated in Room in the Inn when Father Strobel founded the organization. Not say Father Strobel, I think I stand corrected. I'm supposed to say Charlie Strobel.
Either one.
You answer either way, right? St. Henry houses both men and women and children. We also take up to 24 from Room in the Inn and house them here overnight on Sunday evenings. I get to participate by staying at home. My husband and my 2 daughters come and spend the night. So I get to stay home with the dog and he comes. So the next morning I get to hear all about it. But all that to say, it's a magnificent ministry. It's a ministry to the homeless during the cold season, during the warm season, and any time of the year. There are always homeless. There will probably always be homeless. And they are looking into the face of God. So I give you Charlie Strobel, the founder of Room in the Inn.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you all for being willing to sit here and listen to this. And Father Mark, I don't know if he's still here, but
There he is.
I want to thank him for opening the church for the concert chorale earlier and for all the fine pastoral care that he gives you. When you're a priest and a pastor and you preach every Sunday, you have to look like you really are cool and kind of got it all together. Where inside you're churning with anxiety about making sure that you're speaking God's word and not your own. And so it's a difficult gift to practice. And I know from what I've heard about Father Mark and when I've seen him, you certainly must appreciate the preaching that he offers. But, so we go on, and I'd like to do 3 things. Janet talked about the Room in the Inn. How many of you know about the Room in the Inn? Some folks at the table where I was eating asked some questions about it. In one sense, it's a numbers game. If you have 140 congregations equally divided over 7 nights of the week, that would be 20 congregations a night. And if 20 congregations come with their vans, they take on an average of 10 people. We can shelter 200 people in this city without it causing a problem. And that's what happens. We have now almost 200 congregations, and they're spread out evenly as much as we can make that happen over the course of the winter months. And on each night we're opening, we have from 200 to 300 people that are looking for shelter in one of those congregations. And tonight, St. Henry's will be hosting 24. And in fact, when I started back in 1986, we had 4 congregations, and St. Henry's was one of them. So St. Henry's has been doing this from the very beginning in 1986. And the way that happened is that I was handing out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at Holy Name as the pastor there, and I got there in '77. And it led to a soup kitchen called Loaves and Fishes, which St. Henry supports. And then in 1985, the Corps of Engineers began tearing down all the shanties and shacks that were along the river where LP Fields sits. And they wanted to clean it up because it was like third world compared to the other side of the river, which was first world. So the Corps of Engineers displaced all of those folks, and they went to the place of least resistance, which was the church parking lot 5 blocks up from the river. And I was inside the rectory, the parsonage, sleeping, and they were out in the parking lot, sleeping out in the cold. So I went downstairs and invited them in to spend the night. I knew they wouldn't hurt each other, but I said, don't hurt each other, don't burn the building down. And they were, of course, friends to one another. And I said, I'll bring you some breakfast in the morning. Well, before I finally made the decision to invite them in, I thought to myself, if I do this, I may end up having to do this for the rest of my life, because they'll be back the next night, and the next night, and the next night. And I thought, well, like Scarlett O'Hara, I'll think about it in the morning, and we'll just invite them in. Which we did, and that led to sheltering them throughout those winter months. And then when the spring came, we spun off Matthew 25, another homeless shelter. And then we got ready for 86, the winter of 86. We sent out letters. Father Bevington was the pastor here, and he said immediately, we'll start, and we'll be one of the first congregations to start. So we started with 4. By the end of January, we had 31. The next year we had 68, then 98, and we've been growing ever since. So that's basically the Room in the Inn model of what people then began to say after doing this here. They began to say, downtown, why don't we do something more long-term? So we've created a linear model. We say we pitch our tent in the chaos of their lives on the street. And the first thing we want to do is to try to get them some shelter and some place to stay with safety and some food and personal hygiene services. And then we want to move them into recovery, which is a health issue. And then out of that into jobs, and then into the journey home. So we have both short-term emergency needs of food, clothing, and shelter that we provide. And then we also have provided the long-term solutions of education, housing, medical, and employment. And we have a huge building downtown. You're welcome to come and volunteer if you want. There's always plenty of things to do. But that's the Room in the Inn story. My story goes back a little bit earlier than that 1986 shelter. In fact, before I say something about that, I'd like to, how many of you are in the RCIA? Okay, this is something that I hope will help you going forward, and it may help some of the rest of us who might see a need to apply it in your own spiritual life. The very first class I took at Catholic University in 1965, it was called Introduction to Theology, and the priest at the time, the instructor, he came in and he said, the first thing I want to tell all of you is there are 3 things to remember. Try to distinguish, as you live out your life in faith, try to distinguish between faith, theology, and popular belief. And he said, you probably mixed all those 3 things together and try to survive with whatever it helps you to understand. But he said, you've got to keep a distinction between faith, theology, and popular belief. And then he began to illustrate that. That, for instance, our faith tells us God creates us in the world. Popular belief will interpret that and say, well, God creates in 7 24-hour days, or God creates over an evolutionary period. But we are not trying to define which one of those actions really applies. We have an answer, one or the other of those, if we want it. But that's theology, not faith. One response on the part of a view that God creates in 7 days over a 24-hour period might make sense for you, and it may not make sense for me. Over an evolutionary period, it might make sense for you or me. The point, of course, is that we need to be able to explain it. And so sometimes folks that are joining the church will say, well, do you believe in evolution? I can't believe in evolution. And the point is, it's a theological interpretation. Do you believe God created the world and everything in it? Yes, I do. Well, that's enough. And whether it's evolution or it's in 24 hours, it's your interpretation and your choice. Faith, theology, and popular belief. Now, popular belief sometimes gets a little bit skewed. We used to say, before we could offer communion in the hand, we used to say, you can only receive communion on the tongue. And people accepted, for the most part, accepted the change from receiving communion on the tongue, but of receiving communion in the hand. But some people said, no, that's ruining my faith. Why is it ruining your faith? Well, because I always was told you couldn't touch it. Well, that's popular belief. It has nothing to do with faith. And so, if you believe the Lord is present in the Eucharist, however you want to receive the Lord is really an issue of popular belief. And it seems now that the popular belief is not to receive it on the tongue, to receive it in the hand. So keep that in mind if it will help you. It was the first class I ever heard in theology, and it's really the only one I remember. But I'm glad he said it because it's helped me over the years to be able to distinguish what is really of faith and what is really maybe just popular belief. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. Secondly, I'd like to talk about what happens to me before I get the Holy Name and start bringing the end. I've written some of this out so that I don't hold you up. I think I want to stop and have some time for questions. But first I want you to know a little bit about me. I was born north of the Bicentennial Mall in North Nashville, a block off of Jefferson, right down the street from my parish church, the Church of the Assumption. I remember scenes when I was 5 or 6 years of age that stick with me today and have much to do with who I am. My father died when I was 4, leaving my mother to raise 4 children, and with 2 great aunts, Aunt Molly and Aunt Kate, who helped when she went to work outside the home. They helped to take care of us. North Nashville was known at the time, not as Germantown as it's known now, but it was known as Cab Hollow. It was not unlike other poor parts of the city, with quirky names like Germantown, Flat Rock, Rock City, and Trumbull Bottoms. 2 blocks away was the Worthen Bag Corporation, the principal employer of the area. And then the Cheatham projects were built right across the street from the Worthen Bag. They were the first public housing projects in the city, and they were a step up because the people who moved into public housing at the Cheatham place got an indoor bathroom. We lived in a neighborhood where there were a lot of outhouses instead of indoor plumbing. Although some folks rode buses to the western part of the town to do domestic work, most folks that worked in the area, and everyone was poor. In the economy of the time, the poor worked for the poor. And they found dignity in that work. People grew vegetables and sold them off the backs of horse-drawn wagons. Others sold blocks of ice for ice boxes, not refrigerators. Others hauled coal for the people to burn. Men with wagons picked up people's food garbage and fed it to their pigs on the outskirts of the border. They were slop men, we call them. There were others took in laundry. Miss Poole was the lady that took in laundry. Not everybody had laundromats. They had just the old washing machines. And so Miss Poole would come once a week and pick up our laundry and wash them, and then we paid for them. As I'm telling you this, I'm gathering that you're trying to wonder, well, how old is he? Well, to be honest, I'm 74. And these are images of a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old boy. Once a week, Sadie would come. Now, Sadie was African American, and she came and always stayed for lunch. Her job was to help do the ironing, because the clothes had to be ironed. She would stay for lunch, but she sat over on the side of the kitchen table by the window. And I would say to her, Miss Sadie, why don't you sit over here with us at the table and eat lunch? And she said, no, thank you, Mr. Charles. I want to stay by the window where it's cool. And so I would ask her, and every time she would say the same thing, she would refuse to sit with us. And then I said to her once, I said, you know, Sadie, you don't have to call me Mr. Charles. You can just call me Charles, because I'm 6. And she said, and she's 86. And she said, okay, Mr. Charles. And every time I asked her to say, call me Charles, she said, okay, Mr. Charles. What stuck with me was that she, which I didn't come to realize until later, but she had endured and was a part of the history of centuries of segregation expressed in so many forms of hatred and violence and death that humiliated generations of people of color ever since they first were sold into slavery in America. But I was too young to know about that. And you're not too young to know about it. We were an apartheid culture back then. And that's just the way it was. There was no great movement to want to change that, not even among the churches. I remember Tony Winston. There's a restaurant in North Nashville called Monell's. You're familiar with Monell's on 6th Avenue. We lived on 7th on Monell's. Tony Winston and his family lived in Monell's. And he was closer to the Assumption Church and School than we were on 7th. So I ran into him about the time that you begin to explore the neighborhood past your own yard. And I saw him in the playground, and we got to talking, and I said, well, what's your name? He says, Tony. I said, where do you go to school? He said, I go to St. Vincent's. And I said, you go to St. Vincent's? Why don't you go to the Assumption School like I do? And he said, because I go to St. Vincent's. So I go home, and I said, I met a boy in the playground today, Mom, and his name is Tony. She said, oh, the Winston, they're wonderful people. She said, yeah, they live over on 6th Avenue. And I said, but he goes to St. Vincent's. And she said, that's right, he goes to St. Vincent's. I said, why doesn't he go to the Assumption? And she said, because he goes to St. Vincent. There was no real answer. And I couldn't factor in that he was African American and I wasn't. And that the church had created a special parish for the African Americans, Catholics in our city. And that's just the way it was. There was another family who lived behind the house next door to us in a horse barn that had been converted into a 2-room house or shack. And he went to work every day hauling coal and came back at 6 to check on his family and eat supper. Then he went out for the evening to work in a school as a janitor. So he worked from about 6 in the morning to probably 10 or 12 at night. And he never got out of that shack. And he raised his family. And what happens to me is that when I get older and I hear people say that the poor are lazy and won't take any initiative, that wasn't my reference point at all. Not after seeing what I saw. I remember my mother telling the story of going to tent meetings. And she was Catholic, and her father, my grandfather, didn't want her going to a tent. The tent meeting was, as you can imagine, just a tent set up for evangelization and for a revival in the neighborhood. And there was a tent meeting that was right there in one of the plots, vacant plots. And my mother loved the singing and the shouting. And so she went to the tent meeting against her father's wishes. And there she had a little girl friend who kept on the lookout for Mr. Henry, because he would come down to get her and she would slip out from the tent and go home. But now, what she taught me, which I didn't realize until later, is that everybody has opportunities and exposure to the life of God and God's Spirit. And that it wasn't just a Catholic view that she believed in. She believed in everybody having some kind of understanding, and what turns out to be an ecumenical understanding of interfaith activities. All these memories, at an early age, crystallized my thinking to the point when I got out of Father Ryan High School, I decided to go to the seminary. And I ended up going to Catholic University from 65 to 70, 1965 to 70. And if you were to ask me, what 5 years would you like to be in Washington, D.C. in the last 100 years, I would say I'd like to be in Washington from 65 to 70. And that's exactly what gift I was given. We learned a lot of theology out in the protests around the Vietnam War, around civil rights, around Resurrection City, the Poor People's Campaign. Perhaps maybe more practical application of theology than what we were receiving in the classrooms. And so that experience of being in theology at Catholic University gave me a particular bias, which you're going to hear about, and it's an important thing that I want to say to you. And the bias is in the development of a theology for the poor. Starting with the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, I heard over and over, like the prophets called to defend the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Or the psalmist prayed that the Lord hears the cries of the poor. Or lavishly God gives to the poor. Or God lifts up the lowly to high places. Or go sell all you possess and give to the poor. Or blessed are the poor. And that dozens and dozens of references are like that if you had begun to be familiar with the Bible, especially the New Testament. You've got all this reference about loving and caring and taking care of the poor. But nothing struck me with such force at the time that when my scripture professor unfolded the meaning of a word that I'd like to share with you as a gift tonight. It's little known, it's a beautiful word, it's little known and rarely used. You may forget the word, but I hope you remember its concept. And the word is Anawim. Has anybody heard the word Anawim? A-N-I-W-I-N. A-N-A-W-I-N. Anawim. How many of you have heard the word? I knew Father would have. The word Anawim is a Hebrew word for poor. So if Jesus were just talking to us in Hebrew, he would say, blessed are the Anawim, not blessed are the poor. Poor is kind of just a kind of a raw sounding word. But Anawim has a melodic sound to it, but it's a more beautiful concept when you get to know what it means. More than an economic condition, the word refers to all of us as we are seen by God. The word refers to all of us, not just the economic poor. Job reminds us that each of us is born naked. I come into the world, naked I return again. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Jesus proclaims the first beatitude, blessed are the poor. but his translation would have been, blessed are the Anawim. Anawim defines all of us, every man, woman, and child, as a blessing. Hear that. Anawim defines us as a blessing. One blessing that we know we're incapable of being happy all by ourselves. And that's our poverty. We're incapable of being happy all by ourselves. We need one another. And that's what Anawim brings us to understand, is the poverty of our life without each other. If we need to, we can prove it to ourselves. For as soon as we become honest and aware of what it means to live and breathe and embrace the dawn of the gift of a new day dawning, it comes to us as a total gift. Tomorrow morning is a total gift to us, whether we wake up or not. And as our entitlement, not as our entitlement. Tomorrow is not an entitled piece of life, but it's something to avoid, but it's something essential to living a life of love. Spiritual writers over the centuries say that there is no possible conversion unless one experiences a poverty of self. This is all it's all at the heart of the meaning of the word Anawim. If we're called to experience a poverty of self, that's what Anawim is referring to. The Anawim are not simply the ones without change in their pockets. The Anawim are all of us as seen by God. Yet most of us don't want to think of ourselves as poor, much less blessed in our poverty. We lose sight of the fact that this is how we're created. Long before we achieve power, prestige, possessions, or even pigmentation, we're naked, vulnerable, and poor, and dependent on a woman for our survival. When we forget this basic truth about ourselves, whether we're people of faith or not, we end up fighting for our own survival rather than helping each other survive. As we gather possessions, power, and prestige, we begin to separate, creating all kinds of differences of class and status. Although almost every one of us believes in a necessity of some possessions, the differences they create inspire extreme competition, rivalry, and war. From the cultural existence of nations, states, tribes, classes, castes, and social classes, and to the more informed groupings and congregations, clubs, associations, businesses, and teams, our separation can diminish our realization of this divine truth proclaimed from the beginning. We share a common humanity. We share a common poverty. But understanding ourselves as Anawim establishes an equality among us that can lead to the greatest blessing imaginable, which is human kindness. Rather than allowing my riches to divide me, we can discipline ourselves to recognize how each one of us is the same. We can be united in a poverty that yields a generosity of spirit. The knowledge that we are poor and the recognition that everybody around us engages in that same understanding of our poverty can lead to the greatest amount of generosity. We understand this notion of Anawim whenever we prefer service to others over personal advantage. When we do so, then and only then will the economic poor have any hope of our understanding and economic deliverance from their grinding, degrading conditions because of our generosity. That's what the professor talked to me about. And I remember taking notes and just being excited about something that I was learning. And a lot of my theology I didn't get that excited about. But it was this notion that God has this preferential option for the poor. And that it's not a question of us saying, I don't believe it. We don't want to be driven to that kind of conclusion. We want to be excited with the fact that we contribute to this understanding of God's generous love for the poor by the response that we give in our own lives. So his word struck me to the core, and his biblical framework formed me to ask How does this concept translate it in the modern world? Because you can hear it in a classroom, but then I have to say, well, how do we get it translated into life? How do we live that out? And it's the church calling us to do that, then I've got to find some research about it. And the research I found was this principle that's consistent with similar teachings from all the major religions of the world. It could be expressed in these 6 principles. And these principles probably will define your political leanings. The church is involved in politics, as you know, even though we may hear sometimes our leadership say we're not involved in politics. But you hear these principles, and these are 6 principles that have been put together by the U.S. Bishops' Conference. And they have a political sound to them. The needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. 1. The needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. The freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. 2. 3. The participation of marginalized groups takes priority over the preservation of systems that exclude them. 4. The rights of workers take priority over the minimization of profits, maximization of profits. 5. The preservation of the environment takes priority over the uncontrolled industrial expansion. 6. The production to meet social needs takes priority over the production for military purposes. Now these 6 principles tell us how we should be speaking as church, as leaders of the gospel of Jesus. And these 6 principles are not accepted very well in today's world. The last principle reminds us that we cannot talk about poverty without talking about war and their interconnectedness. For poverty produces war, and war produces poverty. Archbishop Desmond Tutu says simply, we will never win a war against terror as long as the conditions for poverty and injustice remain. Poverty breeds terrorism. So we should stop spending billions of dollars on weapons of destruction and instead feed the hungry people of the world. Then we'll stop terrorism. If we want to live in peace, we have to realize that we are all members of the same family. Those principles are before me when I think about waking up and doing what I need to be doing. And I'm not sure how you would hear all of this, but I did not want to take the whole hour and talk. But let me stop right there a minute and see if there's any, does anybody have any reaction to what I just said? Oh. Yes, ma'am.
Could you repeat the 3rd one, because I'd like to remember it?
Repeat.
Number 3.
Number 3. The participation of marginalized groups takes priority over the preservation of systems that exclude them. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Would you share a story or two in your almost 30 years of working with the homeless that you just found exceptionally heartwarming?
Yes. I'll tell you what I think is happening. I shared this at the table tonight. It's happening in Nashville at least, and maybe all over. There was a fellow who came 3 nights ago to the room in the inn for shelter. And he looked, and I want to say this and be sensitive about it, he looked like he was middle class. He was dressed neatly and didn't, at first I thought he was a volunteer. And he said, no, I'm on the streets. And I said, how long have you been on the streets? He said, 2 days. I found out 2 days ago that my landlord, I rent and I have a job. And he said, my landlord sold the building, and they're tearing it down, and I've lost my place to live. Now, his condition is not one of alcohol addiction or medical situations or mental illness. It's basically housing. And I think that's beginning to be more of a problem for us, and those of you in real estate know what I'm talking about. We're losing affordable housing. There's three kinds of housing that they're thinking about, the mayor's thinking about trying to have replicated. There's market rate housing. People can buy whatever the rate is. There's workforce housing, which is housing along corridors. They're trying to develop around the main corridors that are for bank tellers, and police and fire and teachers, workforce housing. And then there's the third kind of housing, which has no legs, which is for the homeless, for the poor, affordable housing, that low-income housing. That's one story. I think that we have in our building downtown a memorial tree. We have leaves, over 800 leaves on this memorial tree that have the names of people who have died and never got off the streets, but came through our program, came through St. Henry's and other places. Jacob Ayers was a horribly unhappy individual. And I used to tell him after I got to know him well enough, I'd say, you were a terrorist, in that he was never going to come in to the room at the end, but didn't mind causing trouble for us. And anytime I had an opportunity to talk to him, I'd say, come on, you can come in. There's nothing preventing you. He said, I don't want to. And it went on and on like that for years. And one day he was so upset that he came upstairs, and I said, well, tell me what's going on. And he said, when I was 14, my brother and I, he was 13. The two of us were in the project, and we were just playing. And somebody came by to buy some drugs and had a gun, and ended up, he said, we were in the middle of the gunfire, and my brother got shot, and I held him in my arms when he died. And he said, I've hated white people ever since. And what could you say except how sorry you were? And I wish I could say there was a happy ending, but he got into some, one night he was so intoxicated that he somehow either fell asleep or just couldn't get up and out of the way, but he was on the railroad tracks. And the train came and severed his legs right at his groin. And he crawled down the hill to the guest house that we run. But it was 3 in the morning and nobody heard it. And he bled to death outside our facility. So there's some wonderful stories of people that have gotten jobs, have gotten housing, and have moved on. You never hear that. You see a group of people that have fallen out of systems that were created to help you and me and them. And I usually say there are about 7 systems that we all are supposed to participate in, and if we are compliant, we become somewhat successful and can survive on our own. Medical, mental health, education, employment, housing, family, and even religion. Now, all of those systems are not interconnected. In fact, that's one of the problems in our outreach with the homeless, is that we have all of these systems that are kind of like silos. They really, they offer the promise of, let's say, employment, but if you don't have transportation, you can't make that work. They offer maybe a medical respite for the heart attack you've had, but you're released from the hospital and there's no place to stay. We have a guest house respite care where we do accept people that are coming out of hospitals. But before that, they were just released to the streets. So there's no connection of the hospital care with residential care. And people are left to kind of find it out on their own. So I don't know if I could look at the names of all those leaves on the tree and see certain names and tell you a story. Once it would trigger my memory. But I think what allows you at Room in the Inn, St. Henry's, what you're given is an understanding of the complexity of homelessness. And that's whenever we were starting, I thought of the Room in the Inn as an immediate response to a felt need, which was shelter. But I also thought that if people in the ordinary circumstances of the church were to serve them, they would begin to, and talk to them, they would begin to understand the complexity of the problem. And in the beginning, it didn't happen. What happened is the homeless would come and get their food and go off to the corner to sit and eat by themselves. And the homeless volunteers would serve the food across the serving line, but not come around and eat together. And I used to say, I wish they would do that, but I'm not going to tell them. I just hope that the grace of the Holy Spirit will inspire them to sit down and eat a meal together. And what has happened is it does happen like that now. People have realized they don't need to be afraid. They hear all of the reasons why people are homeless. In fact, I used to say, what does Room in the Inn represent? What are some images? And one image would be that it's like Ellis Island for urban refugees that come in. It's like a Red Cross tent in a war zone, and that applies. It's like an oasis in a concrete asphalt desert, and that applies. And then it dawned on me, there's something better than those images as they are. And I thought of the notion of a communion meal, and that what happens with the lasagna and the iced tea can be as powerful as the Passover lamb and the choicest wines of 2,000 years ago. That 12 people can eat a meal at a McDonald's, but it's not a communion meal. But if you gather around the table and there's the sharing of food, it has the same power as church on Sunday, if you look at it that way. And you may say, well, the homeless don't know that. And I want to say, well, when you think about the Last Supper, those disciples, they didn't understand it, neither do we. But we think we do. We try to understand it. But when we break bread together around the table, just like this, there's a sharing. And that sharing can be restorative of life and hope. Rollo May is a famous psychotherapist, and he said the illness, psychological illness, is the inability to wish, to want, to seek, to desire, to hope, to yearn. When a person doesn't have those words in his vocabulary, they probably are losing hope. And so what we're trying to do is establish hope again. When they come back in the morning, after being here, it's the best time of the day for them. They come back refreshed, having showered, having some kind of renewed spirit to go out and keep fighting and keep looking and searching. And they come, by the end of the day, they're beaten down again. So we're not a social service agency. We don't just go 9 to 5. This is so central. I always tell the congregations, and I love to tell you this the same way, you're the spirit and the heart and the soul that gives life to the place downtown church, services downtown. Stop a minute. And let's have some more questions before we close it up. Anybody? What do you hear when I spend this amount of time and write it out and want it to be on your minds when you wake up in the morning, when I talk about poverty? And that it's not they are poor and I'm not, but we're all poor. We all have limitations.
What I hear is what I was so looking forward to hearing you, Jerry, just because of your experience, and just have a better understanding of where the poor are when they come into our churches, and what can we do to just to give them a little joy, to give them what is it that they need, and you have given some insight.
Well, knowing their names, smiling and accepting them, it's a simple act of hospitality, but it's powerful. And I've gotten old now, and I don't know them like I used to know them. And it bothers me that I can't call them by name, some of them by name. By the way, you heard the little boy who was learning the Lord's Prayer, and he said, they said, would you say the Lord's Prayer? And he said, Our Father who art in heaven, how'd you know my name? Which is so important theologically, that we're known by God's as in our name. I'm not even sure what time it is, but I'm aware people have to go. It's 6:45. We got 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Is everybody okay?
Is it? Well, I used to teach at Catholic High School in Knoxville, and I would get excited about something and be talking, and then it was over. I'd say, "Now, you have any questions?" And somebody would raise their hand. I'd say, "Yeah, what is it?" He'd say, "Are you going to the ball game tomorrow night?" So I understand there are no questions. Speaking of the ball game, the Titans, I understand why. But there's got to be a revolution of some sort that's going to try to reverse the fortunes of our world and of our nation. I don't want to get too political involved here, but we have wasted a lot of our money on what I call surplus wealth and extravagant things, materials, toys, when we could have used a lot of that money for social transformation. And we can't, it doesn't seem that we can mandate it. It's almost something that has to be voluntarily offered. I write here none of this social transformation can be mandated, even though the worst of hiring practices and labor conditions, along with the worst of laissez-faire capitalism, has led to government mandates and policies. Think back 100 years and imagine a world of labor without child labor laws, health and safety standards, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a 40-hour week, health insurance, retirement benefits, paid vacations, and the right to organize into unions. These things were never there 100 years ago. In the 1880s, none of that was there. And how has it come to be? Well, the history tells us that all of these benefits that we now enjoy are the result of a lot of labor unions taking it on and fighting, even in creating wars among those labor unions and labor barons. So we're riding on the waves of success of a labor revolution that had thousands of poor people die for these rights and privileges. If you know your history around labor, there's so much of labor successes that were built on the backs and the deaths of labor unions. Our philanthropic heroes, the great names of philanthropy, they owned those companies and did not get those benefits freely and generously, but were mandated by government or the pressures of the violent labor movement. That's a shame when you stop to think that they had all that wealth and they created these huge companies, but it cost so many lives. People dying on the picket line. One of the great spiritual writers of the century, Thomas Merton, listen to this. Certainly the legitimate desire to live a decent and civilized life in the world is no sin. God wills for us an ordered and happy life on earth. But the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Gospels, and the letters of Christian Scripture writers eventually remind us that in practice, the comfort and pleasure of some is generally paid for by the misery and oppression of others. And every rosy picture of our affluent society has a dark side, experience shows. So for the picture of our world as a generous and affluent world, there's a dark side that we don't really think about. And I think our responsibility as Christians, trying to live this gospel that tells us to be kind and compassionate to the poor, that reminds us that we cannot avoid this dark side. I had a seminary professor, Charlie Curran, who said, as a Christian, we always walk with an uneasy conscience. I don't know if you do, but I know there's that part of me that is not always satisfied that I'm doing what I should be doing. Mike, what do you think?
I was just thinking of the Thomas Merton quote about not knowing whether what I'm doing is pleasing, but by trying to please you, Lord, that I know that in itself pleases you.
Do you know what prayer he's talking about? Yeah, Thomas Merton wrote a prayer that said it again.
It goes something like, I'm not sure I know where I'm going, but I do know that by trying, essentially, that to please you, Lord, that in itself is sufficient.
Yeah.
It's the Merton prayer.
Yeah.
And when you said that, that made me think of that and smile.
Here's what happens, I think, to some people who take this call to take care of the poor seriously. How many of you have seen the movies Schindler's List? Well, Schindler, who's not a Jew, but has worked to liberate a lot of Jewish folks during the Holocaust and during the Nazi regime, when he finishes it, he's being recognized by the Jewish community for what he's done to save so many hundreds and hundreds of people. It's a beautiful movie. Schindler, a non-Jew, begins to cry. Here it is. In another movie, Schindler's List, one of the final scenes is where the Jews have been liberated and Schindler is preparing to leave. The Jewish people want to bid him farewell and express their appreciation for all that he did to help them. Schindler, a non-Jew, begins to cry. He is so overwhelmed. He cannot stop crying. His Jewish friend asks him what's wrong. He says over and over, I could have done more. I could have done more. I could have done more. As they try to console him even more with words of appreciation, he continues to repent through the tears. I could have done more. And then he adds, if I had only known sooner. That same dramatically underscores an ancient principle that says that the heart cannot embrace what the mind rejects. Schindler's heart would have been moved much sooner if he'd really known sooner. We could all say the same thing. We could do more if we only knew. It's still not too late for all of us in Nashville. So I think maybe I ought to end there. And thank you for paying attention to this message. And thank you more than ever for loving those folks that are coming tonight.